Hello, everyone. My guest today is Tony Roberts, founder and lead developer at Pixel, spelled Pyxll, who's helping people do more in Excel with Python. Tony has a first-class degree in engineering and computer science from the University of Oxford, and in our conversation we cover misconceptions about Python, Python's versatility in various industries and applications, challenges when using AI to code, using Microsoft Copilot to code in creative and precise modes, the impact of AI on content creation, the transition from VBA to Python for Excel automation, and much, much more. Tony has a ton of insight to share, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did.
Hello and welcome to the Adam Shilton podcast, where we'll help you level up your life by mastering tech, boosting productivity, and sharpening your mind. I'm your host, Adam Shilton. I'm a top voice, technologist, and speaker, and I'm on a mission to help you augment your potential. Join me as we support you on your journey to becoming an irreplaceable human being. Please like and subscribe.
Today I have the pleasure of introducing Tony Roberts, founder at Pixel. That's the Python plugin for Excel. So appreciate you taking the time today, Tony. Everybody knows I love a bit of Python. So yeah, keen to get into the weeds today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's good to be here.
Yeah, no worries at all. So we'll get straight into it, because I don't think Python's become more of a thing recently with the advent of ChatGPT using it, right? Mm-hmm. But before we get into all of that sort of stuff, what do you think are some of the main misconceptions that people have about Python?
I think there's quite a few to varying different degrees, and it's interesting you're saying about Python becoming more popular with ChatGPT, and I think that's definitely true. But I've kind of seen, I guess I've been using Python. I'm embarrassed to say how long, but a long time. But I've definitely seen like different waves of explosions in different industries over the years. And I think with ChatGPT, you're right, it's kind of now becoming even more mainstream than it was before. I think one thing that I see quite often is people coming at it from a non-programming background. And this is, I think, ties in nicely with the ChatGPT thing. And people often think, oh, like programming, and then they panic and they think, oh, that's not for me, it's too hard. And I think that's a big misconception. And I'll come back to that because on the other end, you have people who are like hardcore developers who, have been programming in another language, for a long time. And I think they also have a misconception that Python is just this sort of toy language and it's not for them because it's just for like script kiddies or for doing, non-serious work. And I think kind of both of those misconceptions are like two ends of the spectrum. And this is one of the things I really like about Python is because it actually is really, really accessible for beginners. And it's great, people are teaching in schools and there's kids clubs doing this kind of stuff. There's all kinds of things around that. But it has so much depth to it that it's also used for like actual really serious applications. And it's kind of amazing, just not just the number of libraries, but also the language features, that there's so much coverage that's applicable to different industries. But yeah, I think those are kind of the two main ones that I like to really challenge when I hear.
So when I was originally getting into Python, and I've got a bit of a potted history, so I've done a bit of development in the past, bit of Visual Studio Code and that sort of stuff. But it was when I was in the dynamic space, and it was the Microsoft AI language that they made compulsory for extending the new Dynamics application. So I had to learn it to be able to understand how the software worked, right? But I only really got back into Python after 2022, especially when ChatGPT did the analysis. And that was the time it still gave you a preview of the code that it produced. Now it just hides it in the background unless you go into the settings and you can turn it on. So not a lot of people know that. You can go into the options in ChatGPT now. And if it ever does the analysis, you can get it to show it's working out, which I always recommend people do, because then you can see and validate, instead of just blindly trusting what it's doing, right? But around that time that I was getting more into the weeds, most of the information that you could find online about Python, especially in the finance space, wasn't for corporate finance in terms of automating process, producing visualizations, doing forecasting. it was around that algorithmic trading piece.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether your experience aligns with that, but I think a lot of people still align their thinking of Python to algorithms, trading, lots of complexity. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the case anymore, right?
No, definitely not. I think algorithmic trading is a big industry that uses finance heavily, both in the research side, but also in some cases in the execution side. Probably the research side is the bigger use case for Python for them. Uh, but that's actually a relatively sort of recent thing in Python history, because before then there were lots of finance companies using huge amounts of Python in other areas. Before, I mean, if you go back to, I don't know, when pandas came out, maybe around 2005 or six or something like that. Before then, the story for scientific computing was around using NumPy and SciPy and things like that, and we didn't have the tools in Python to easily do the types of things that pandas enabled. So back then, people were still using Python in finance, but for a wide variety of things, which they're still using it for. But in my experience in finance, we were using it for everything from back office sort of trade reconciliation things, accounting things, like all kinds of stuff, all the way through to front office things like quant modeling. Actually producing valuation models written in Python, exposed to traders, exposed to portfolio management systems, all that kind of stuff. So it really is like a lot broader than just that data analysis part. Although the data analysis part, if you kind of Google stuff online now, there's so much material around that. You'd be forgiven for thinking that was really what Python was designed for, but it's much more general purpose than that.
Mm. And that's definitely what I'm finding is just the breadth of what you can do in it. But before I go through to some of my experimentations, and you can tell me off for whether I'm using it in the right way or not, is around the term that we've used a couple of times, which is libraries. Now, for people that are listening that don't know anything about Python, don't know anything about the concept of libraries, I see libraries as almost like prepackaged templates of code that sit in the background. And I don't know whether that's a correct way of terming it, but you mentioned Pandas, which is a library focused on data manipulation and data structures. I don't know whether you could talk about a couple of the others that you mentioned. What was it, SkyPy and the other one? But am I right
Oh yeah,
in
NumPy.
defining it in that way?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, essentially, a Python package, I suppose, to use the correct terminology, is really a collection of code that's there ready for you to use. So, for example, if you wanted to, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but a function to send a command to some service somewhere to do something, you could write that in Python using the socket library, and you could send commands over the internet directly using that. But that might take you a long time to write. And what you'll find in a lot of cases is someone else has already done that work for you, and then packaged it up as a Python package that you can then nicely install and then just call that function, without having to spend all the time writing it yourself. And that's really what we mean by Python packages, is this like pre-canned stuff. And that's really one of the strengths of Python. Python's what they call a high-level language, because we're not writing machine code or anything like that. But it's a high-level language already. But then you also get these high-level toolkits on top that mean that the actual kind of code that you write as a Python developer can be very, very small and very expressive, but it does a lot because it's leveraging all this underpinning of all these packages that exist in the wider Python ecosystem.
Mm. And so I used to work with, and still do to an extent, work with a lot of developers. And I love the way that they'd always challenge me when I'd request something. Oh, I've got a client that wants to achieve this or whatever. And the general response was, why do you want to do it that way? Or, oh, you could make it so much easier. Or, yeah, we've done that before. We'll just copy that. And I can't remember who it was, but there was something in the back of my memory saying, of course, you need to develop skills as a developer, right? But a lot of development is copying and reusing what already exists. and it's the knowledge of the structure and the use cases and the end goal that is sort of the most useful as a developer. And especially with the advent of these new tools like Devin, I don't know whether you've seen, the automated bot that now, automatically creates codes based on an outcome, is that the actual writing of the code now forms a relatively small part of the overall development timeline, shall we say. A lot more of the effort goes into the scoping, the ensuring that it's being built correctly in the first place, and making sure that it aligns with the output that you want, rather than the actual minutiae of the coding and typing in all the lines. So yeah, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that, but yeah, I wouldn't say cheating, but you get the gist, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there's kind of a spectrum, right? There's like application developers, or these people who are working at a high level, solving these kind of problems, and they have one set of skills. And then there's people who operate at a different level, where they might be the package authors that are kind of doing the minutiae of these toolkits of functions that are required for these more high level tasks. But I think the high level stuff that you were just talking about, the real skill there that an experienced developer kind of offers is maybe not so much in that minutiae of writing like every line of code, but they know what packages are available, they've used them before, and they know how to put the pieces together to get the outcome that you're looking for. But more than that, I think the real skill is being able to talk to a business user or whoever it is and really understand the actual problem. And this is why they ask so many questions. It's like, and you say, oh, I just want it to do this, and but actually, like, just wanting something to do this is like, there's a whole load of other bits of information you need around that. And the skill of the developer is to kind of tease that information out so that you can actually end up with a solution that just does that, but in a way that's predictable and expected, and handles all of the corner cases that the person asking it to do that has probably never even imagined. So yeah, there's kind of a multitude of skills to being a developer, I think.
And it's the corner cases, isn't it? And I'm finding this more and more, is that whenever you've written a code or an app or whatever, you know how much effort goes into debugging and going through all of the various use cases and testing and the various different versions of that. And you're just trying to limit the amount of time you then need to do in the various iterations, because you don't want to hand it over to somebody and then them immediately spot something that they forgot to then mention earlier on in scoping. So yeah, you're absolutely right. A developer will say, well, what if this happens? Or what happens in that scenario? Or have you thought about this? Because they know
Yeah.
it will come out of the weeds in testing anyway. So if that can be built into the scope, if you've got every possible iteration of the if this then that, what happens in these scenarios, then it's going to make for a much smoother process when it actually comes to building.
Yeah, and I think part of the skill is applying some pragmatism to that as well, because often or sometimes you see some projects which it may be like a month's work or a week's work or whatever, but when you start going down to like, oh, what if it does this and what if this happens, then it can balloon out to this like never-ending thing, and suddenly your ship date slips by 2 years because you've got all these edge cases. So a kind of skill is to learn which of those edge cases are actually likely, what takes a lot of time to develop now versus getting something out the door, and just being a bit pragmatic about how much coverage you give to those. But it was interesting. When you were saying that, it reminded me of a system that I wrote. This is going back quite a few years, but it was an underwriting model for commercial real estate. And the guy that was driving the project, said, okay, we get all these leases, and they receive rent on these dates, and interest payments are on these dates. And I said, "Oh, but it's like, is it really the case that in every like commercial real estate deal, the interest is always paid on this date of the month, and it's always monthly?" And he's like, "Yeah, I've never seen one that doesn't." And I'm like, "Okay," but I just sort of, the way I wrote it, I was like, "Well, if that isn't the case, then I want to be able to make some changes so that I'm not locked into that." And then we went live with this, and I think maybe the second deal was like, oh yeah, like we want to do one that pays like biannually or something like. Oh yeah, I can't remember the specifics, but it was something like that. And I just laughed with him, and I just said, oh, you remember what you said it would never have to do? And it's I guess that just comes with experience, kind of knowing the industry that you're working in as well as the development. and being able to apply that to produce something which works, but is also somewhat future-proof or isn't going to need a complete rewrite if the specs change slightly.
And another reason why potentially people can't call themselves developers if they've used AI to write a bit of code, right? Because you're just scratching the surface. And we'll get into that in a second. But just coming back to the point that you made about being pragmatic in your approach, and I had this recently. So, and it's only a small use case. It just relates to data. So, I've got a supplier that I work with that on a monthly basis will send us data, and it's generally in a consistent format. It's not always in a consistent format. The data that's within the columns is always consistent, but the columns sometimes vary a little bit. So Python will rearrange and reformat the data in the columns. It will add in data according to the data points we need in our system, so we're not having to manually key that information in. So that works really well. And then it's packaged into an app just so that everybody doesn't have to run Python on their machines. That's just a really, really simple user interface that's select file, like import, and then it's got a little guide as well, button to a web link that tells people how to use the app. Now, I did a couple of tests with different versions of supplier data from different points in time just to check that I was at least taking into account some of the variances in the input data. But there are still variances in that data when it comes through. Now, you could spend forever and a day trying to account for all of those iterations in the code by saying it could be any number of these variations, and then you could maybe go into like fuzzy match scenarios, if it loosely relates to this. I'm sure there'll be a way of doing it, but in reality, all that now happens is there's an error that pops up if one of the columns doesn't match the naming convention. And then all the user has to do using the app is just rename a column. That is still like 100 times faster than the manual reformatting that we did before, but avoids having to create this Frankenstein bit of code that might end up totally unusable just for a little bit of variation that can be easily be accounted for. So I just wanted to touch on that because I think that stresses the pragmatic approach versus trying to engineer in every eventuality, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that also kind of brings up another point, which is, and I think this is maybe something that you learn with experience as well, is actually error handling in your code. If you may not be covering all of the edge cases, but at least having a few kind of sensible checks in there to say, oh, if this doesn't look right, then display an error to the user and let them do something about it, rather than just, having in your case a web app, I guess, saying like, service error 500, and then the user's like, oh, what do they do? So being slightly defensive in those cases where it doesn't really matter if there's an error in the input data, someone can load it up and change it or whatever, or use your app to change it. But yeah, rather than worrying about like, oh, if it doesn't work in every case, as long as the user has a way to see why it's not working, then they can figure a way around it.
Yeah, and I think. And this comes to experience as well, is so a lot of my learning of Python, because I am a doer rather than a reader, because I find that if I read stuff, like sometimes I'll put it into action, sometimes I won't. Whereas, and it's not necessarily the right approach, but I'll try and do something first. And then when I hit a block, I'll then try and learn how to get over that roadblock instead of trying to learn about what every roadblock could be before I actually do some stuff. But it's interesting, and we don't have to go into the weeds, but simple stuff in Python is a print message that, even if you're not exporting the output data to a spreadsheet or whatever it happens to be, you can print the output to at least see it when you're running code and doing the testing. And that's something that unless you know, you don't know, right? And I remember, and it relates to that fuzzy match that I mentioned earlier. I was pulling out some data in a free text field, which was a nightmare. And all of that free text information did have some keywords that I was trying to pull out and format into a drop-down list. Now, of course, precise match wasn't going to work because it was free text and some of it was embellished. Some of it was 3 words, some of it was 4 words. But I knew the keywords that I wanted to pull out. Initially, the output wasn't what I wanted. It was okay, but it wasn't great. And then I realized off the back of it, right, well, wouldn't it just be easier if I just printed the output before it actually spat out the data, and I'm then into deleting spreadsheets and reformatting spreadsheets? And it's little stuff like that that comes with usage over time that you miss in just trying to get something to dump out finished code for you.
Yeah. No, I think it's kind of interesting that you mentioned that, because I think when you're learning to code, doing it because you have a problem is the best kind of motivator. But sometimes you do need to take a step back and actually have some kind of foundational knowledge. And I really think with Python, like I said, one of the misconceptions is that it's hard to learn. And I think also that can be because if you have a problem, you're like, okay, right, I'm going to learn Python to solve this problem, then you might be starting with a problem that's too hard. And in those cases, it maybe makes sense to take a step back and say, okay, well, actually, what is Python? How do I run it? What's a script? What's a Jupyter notebook? Just learn some of the vocabulary first, and then spend half a day doing that. And then you'll find that everything else just flows so much better. And things like knowing that you can print stuff is a great example of that, because if you're trying to write Python code without knowing that, then it's really, really limiting. It reminds me of back when I was at university. I was doing this is all like C code, I think, and I was doing some projects to do with like 3D graphics, and I was writing all this code, and I just got this bug, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. I had print statements everywhere, and then I said to my supervisor, like, oh, I'm really struggling with this. What can I do? And he's like, oh, well, let's just have a look at that in the debugger. And I was like, the do-water? And this is all in like Emacs on a Solaris machine or whatever. And it was just like this debug mode in Emacs that I'd never seen before. And it was like stepping through code and looking at variables. And I was like, my mind was blown. And whereas if someone had shown me that, when I'd first started, those sort of years of print statements would have been that much easier. And I think and it's the same, like if you don't know that you can print, then how can you get an idea of what the internal state of your program is? So yeah, there's these little bits that you pick up as you go along, but the more sort of foundational stuff you can learn early on, the easier you make your life.
So following that chain of thought, then what do we think the risks are in people that don't have foundational knowledge, just using AI to produce code without? Because I've done it, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. Yeah, what are some of the risks that people might encounter without that base knowledge?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think as well as the risks, obviously, we have to remember that there's huge benefits, like the productivity benefits of being able to ask ChatGPT or whatever, give me some code to do this is kind of massive. And also another kind of really interesting thing, I don't know if you've tried this, giving ChatGPT some code and saying, what does this code do, is really cool. And that for learning Python, people new to Python, that's, I think, going to be pretty invaluable. I think the only concerns I have around it are if people think it's like a magic bullet, and you want to type in, I've got this problem, give me some Python code to solve it. Because even if it does it perfectly and it gives you the Python code that appears to solve your problem exactly, if you don't really understand what it's doing, then if you need to adapt that later, you might ask ChatGPT to produce a new code for a new problem. But if you don't really understand what it's doing, you can't adapt it yourself, and you can't really verify that what it's doing is right. And kind of in the most extreme case, it might give you this code, but you don't even know how to run it. You could ask ChatGPT how to run it, of course. But I guess what I'm getting at is where I think it's more useful and kind of less risky, if you like, is if you have that base knowledge of what you're doing, and you're writing some code. And let's say we talked about packages earlier, but let's say there's a package that you've come across, but you don't really know how to use it yet. It's got all the docs online, but you just want to do something quite simple. You could ask ChatGPT, okay, how do I use this package to do this thing? And it can give you like a summary of the documentation, telling you the methods that you're most likely to want to use and how to use those, and give you a bit of code that you can then copy and paste and adapt into your existing code to see how to use it. And I think that's like a massive time saver. That summarizing of the docs and giving you like the information that you need in a digestible way, I think is incredibly powerful, and that's going to be like the biggest, one of the sort of big productivity wins, I think, of using AI in coding, rather than seeing it as this silver bullet where you put in a prompt and out comes a fully finished application.
And I think you're dead right. And I'll emphasize that tip that you gave in terms of the starting point might be to grab some code from somewhere and get whatever AI you're using, whether it's ChatGPT, Claude, Microsoft Copilot, to run you step by step through exactly what's that doing. And like places like GitHub are your friend with that sort of stuff, right? You go into GitHub, see some repositories of what people have already built and download the code from there, and you're away, right? So I didn't want to skip over that because I think it's a really valid point. But then the second piece to that is not biting off more than you can chew, as you say. So what are those little use cases that you can do with the training wheels on, as it were, before you then decide to expand that, breaking down that really big problem that you said might end in failure because you're trying to bite off more than you can chew, and just distilling that into the smallest portion that might still be a win for you. And I'll give an example of where I bit off more than I could chew recently, and it actually relates to podcasting. So as part of my process in producing a podcast, and the process might change a little bit, is we're recording on a Squadcast right now. Once the video is done, we download the video. It generally then goes into Descript, which I use for the editing, and Descript has a transcriber, so it will pull out the text. I, as a human, then have to look through that text and pull out the juicy bits for the teaser. Yeah, because that's what hooks people in initially, right? The best, most emotive, most controversial bits, that they go at the top. But recently I started using AI to point me in the right direction, not to do the job. I'd say, look at the most emotive, juiciest bits in the podcast and give me a list of 10 or 20 points that I can then review to see what's best. But now I'm trying to outsource more to the point where I don't even have to open Descript on my machine, but I still need to be able to pick out the part of the podcast that is most interesting. And I can say to my guy in Bangladesh, this is the intro that I want you to use. So I thought, right, okay, well, if I'm not using Descript, I'm going to need to transcribe to begin with. So the workflow is download video file, and then could I get code to run the OpenAI Whisper model, which is their audio transcription model, to do exactly that for me, to the point where all I've got to do is download. I then get an output in a Word document once the code's done its piece using the Whisper API, and then all I've got to do is say to the outsourced guy, this is the bit that I want you to use. Now, the limitation I had is, firstly, the OpenAI Whisper has like a really big API. And the second limitation is the AI is only trained up to a certain point. So I went round and round in circles trying to get it to tell me why it was producing errors in the code. And it couldn't because it didn't have the most up-to-date API on the terminology when running that code. Now, if I'd said to ChatGPT 4.0, which is probably better, can you search the internet for the most up-to-date API? It probably would have done the job for me. But what I had to do is open the new API on a browser. I had to manually debug the bits of code that weren't working by transferring in those little tidbits of newly updated code so that it all worked okay. And I just about got there. But that was before having to do all of the transcript stuff, because by default, Whisper doesn't produce a time code. And if it does it on every single word or every single line, which is just totally unusable. So I then had to get Python to understand what a phrase was, make sure that it was only producing a timestamp at the beginning of the phrase. And it was an absolute nightmare. It was a good learning exercise, don't get me wrong, but I lost probably about a day to it before then deciding I'm not going to do this. Like, I'll just do the first bit in Descript myself, and then I'll just share the Descript link.
I guess that comes back to our talk about pragmatism. Uh,
Absolutely, because I was living in this world of thinking I just want to be totally hands off. Like literally, I just want to click a button and everything else to do the rest. But in
but
reality,
did you find that did ChatGPT just say, okay, here's this code, it will work, or did it say, this is using an old API, use at your own risk?
no, it was very persistent to say this is the code.
I've had exactly the same experience where you ask it to do something and you say, "Oh, this method that you're using on line X doesn't exist." And it's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, let me redo this," and then it does something else which also just doesn't exist. And I think that's one of the pitfalls of if you're not a developer and you're thinking, "Oh, I can use AI to generate code," you can to a certain extent, but whether it works or not is you kind of need to have some understanding of what you're doing and understand the limitations. And this is new technology, right? So it's going to get better.
Mm.
Uh, but I think, yeah, using it as a productivity tool
Mm.
rather than a black box that will produce you as a solution will yield good results rather than just, in your case, where it's just leading to frustration because you're trying to make it produce something which it can't do, either because it doesn't have the knowledge of the latest API or because it may be that there's in the case I was looking at a different package which had loads of history for an older version, and then a breaking change comes out in a new version, but it's after the cutoff of when it's been trained. So how would it know? Um, but I think once you understand those limitations, you can say, okay, well, this code is still useful to me. I just need to make a few changes here and here, and understand the changes in the API, and then you're good to go again.
I was running an experiment at that time, deliberately not using ChatGPT, and maybe I suffered because of it. So I was on the chain of thought that said Microsoft Copilot just uses GPT-4 in the background, so that's what I'll use. Like it's no different. So the experiment was, can I do without ChatGPT using free tools for a couple of weeks? And the
Mm-hmm.
reality was I could. With that stumbling block, though, I did run it through Claude to see whether it performed any better. Didn't produce any better result. I tried with Llama 3, the latest Meta one that's meant to be super good with coding. No better. Before having to do the manual exercise of, translating the new API into the code
Yeah,
myself before
and
then scrapping it
I
totally.
think probably what you'll find is just on the typical Python coding challenges, that kind of stuff that don't require third-party libraries.
Hmm.
It'll be perfect and it will produce the right answers. But once you start requiring more complex dependencies and things that it doesn't have full knowledge of, it's then going to start making more mistakes.
And I think that's where we might start getting into bot territory. And I've not had a load of success with bots because, of course, in ChatGPT, you can now create GPTs. There's other bot platforms as well out there whereby you can upload knowledge. So maybe that'll be an interesting experiment next time with the new GPT-4 model, assuming that it's not been trained on the most up-to-date Whisper API, is to just do a dump of the web page where the API is explained into a PDF and upload that as knowledge to the bot to see whether that does
Mm-hmm.
any better. Because in theory,
Well,
then it's got that information. Really quick, guys, as you know, I don't have sponsors on the show. So to help me, it would be great if you could share with just one other person, leave a review, give a thumbs up, and subscribe. It really does make a difference. Now back to the show.
yeah, I've been experimenting with bots and stuff just for my own support page, and I guess I've been playing with them for maybe the last year or 18 months or something, and it's kind of interesting just the pace of change. So I actually have one now that's live on the website, which I think is pretty decent, but that's just trained on my website and on the FAQ. Uh, and it's very polite and it can answer basic things. But what I like is that it's will get to a point where it just says, "Oh, just reach out to support and we'll help you there." Um, Whereas I found on the kind of earlier attempts I had, the different bots that I was using would be much more assertive about saying "No, this is the answer," and just spewing rubbish. Uh, so I think there has been in that regard significant progress in kind of measuring the certainty of how good an answer is. So now a bot can say, "Oh, actually, it might be this, but I'm not really sure." Go and ask a human, and I think that's good progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And are you using an off-the-shelf platform for that, or is it one that you built yourself?
No, it's off the shelf. Yeah,
Okay, cool. You may
it's
have.
I only put it on the website 2 days ago. It's docspot.ai.
Okay, it's not one I've heard on. I'll check it out.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, going back to the point that you asked earlier about did the AI tell you verbatim that that is the answer as opposed to saying this is this version? That's not the only instance where it has been pretty hell bent on not giving a different answer. And I was looking at this recently because in Microsoft Copilot, you've got the conversation style. So it can either be creative, balanced, or precise, which just relates to temperature. Yeah, so we're just controlling the temperature there on how accurate or creative the response from the AI is. I thought that if I was generating code in precise mode, that the likelihood of it producing better answers would be better than in creative mode. But I was wrong. I got more verbatim answers, which now makes total sense of the AI saying, this is how it works. This is how it works. And even when I pasted the error back in saying it's still not working, it still produced exactly the same response every time. But I think switching to creative mode, that's where it actually took a different tact. And it thought, okay, well, if I am looking at something in a slightly different way, i.e., a less standard way of achieving this, maybe we can try this instead. So in the end, I just ended up using creative mode, like higher or lower temperatures or whatever it is for the coding exercise. In the end, it works a lot better.
That's really interesting. I hadn't really played around with the different modes too much. I just kind of assumed that they were, different prompts, so that it would be more or less polite or more or less formal. Hadn't really considered it would actually affect the answer. I thought it would just be the tone in which it spoke.
No, so it's and I use the example. So I did a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and I talked in more detail about temperature because obviously most people are now familiar with the term prompt engineering, which at a high level is how detailed and instructional your prompts are. But from an AI engineering perspective, prompt engineering is actually a lot deeper than that. And you've got the concept of, is it zero shot or few shot prompting? Am I using examples to refine the answer from the large language model? And the example I used, if you don't have the ability to control temperature, because of course ChatGPT doesn't have a temperature control, it just does it for you. Same with Anthropic. It's only Copilot that has that conversational style that relates to the temperature from my knowledge at the moment. But I use the example of what does a dog like to do? And there could be a number of outputs. Yeah, so dogs like going on walks, dogs like to play, dogs like to eat, dogs like to sleep. Now, in a more creative mode, the likelihood of it giving that same most common answer more often is less than on precise mode. Yeah, so it may be that in creative mode, the AI is going to output going for walks 40%, whereas going for walks in more precise mode will give that answer more often because it is the more precise, i.e., the pattern that is recognized most often in the training data. So when we talk about temperature, I guess there's an element that could relate to tone, especially if you're trying to get it to be militant in the way that it recalls information. So if you are tying it to a data source and you're using a precise mode, then it could just verbatim give back the information that's in the data source, whereas a more creative mode might add a few more frilly words around the edges, for example. But in that context, it's purely how much do I want to align with the commonalities in my training data? It comes back to that whole predictive text piece versus how much variability do I want the AI to produce in my response. And going back to the coding example, I think the only way that it could work around some of the areas is to look at different iterations of what could be the answer, whereas the precise mode was just saying, because this is the most commonly seen in the training data, this is going to be the answer.
That's really interesting. I might play with that later because I'm just thinking, typical sort of coding interview question. You might ask someone to write Fibonacci as a function, and I'm thinking, if would Copilot leap to like a recursive version because that's the one that's most commonly on Stack Overflow or things like that. But then there's a matrix form of that which is probably much less common. It's probably on the Wikipedia page and a few other places. So in creative mode, it might give me that version of the code a percentage of times, but in the strict mode, it might only give me like the iterative or recursive
Mm.
version because that's the most common that it finds online. Like, so it give me that 100% of the time.
Give it a go and start new chat conversations every time you ask the same question. So do it in precise mode, ask the question, create another chat in precise mode, ask the question, do it maybe 3 or 4 times, see what happens, and then do the same in creative mode. Yeah, because then you know every time it's not recalling. But because if you ask it in the same chat, yeah, it will definitely produce a different response. Because if you're asking again, it's obviously not provided the right response first time round, right? So
Yeah.
let me know how you get on. I'm interested in that sort of stuff. And
Will do.
the other piece as well, not using Microsoft Copilot, is if you go into either the OpenAI or the Anthropic playground. So it's platform.openai.com if you want to get into the back end where there's a workbench, or console.anthropic.com where I think it's called workbench. Sorry, in OpenAI it's called a playground. In Anthropic it's called a workbench. And in the top right of both of those tools, you can set the temperature manually. Yeah, and it's got a prompt testing area, which is generally used for developers when they are connecting via API in informing how precise they want the response to be via the API, but you can still give it a go yourself. I sometimes do that. So I don't pay for Claude, for example, because it's 20 quid a month and I already pay for enough AI tools. But because I know when I run a prompt on the workbench, it's going to cost me 0.02p to run a prompt, I'll sometimes use the Opus model there, which is the bigger all singing all dancing model, because I know I only need to use it once a week, but I've got a specific use case for that. And sometimes it's large transcripts because Opus and some of the other models have got a 200,000 context window, so they can absorb considerably more data than some of the other models.
I think the one thing that's like really interesting to me about all this stuff is obviously we're sort of deep in the weeds now and talking about the developer tools and that kind of stuff, which is great and really interesting. But I think what's kind of more interesting is just how pervasive these things are becoming, and you're seeing like more and more tools with like an AI button, all powered through these APIs, and just the impact that it has on so many different things that we use on a daily basis. And I'm thinking things like when I post something on LinkedIn, it now has a button where you just say, "Oh, just rewrite this in it using AI for me," and it's like suddenly I'm my own copywriter. And but it's just amazing, like how many different applications are kind of integrating with these things. And I think the more use cases that we see, to me, that's kind of like even more interesting than the like nitty gritty internals of how it works and the different feature flags that we can turn on or off.
The content one is an interesting one, and I actually hate the fact that LinkedIn have started building AI into the platform because AI comments on LinkedIn are prolific.
We're all going to end up sounding the same. It's like
well, that's exactly it, and how many emails do you get now that start with "I hope this finds you well"? And it's an AI email because whenever you ask AI to write a cold email, because that's the most commonly used cold email framework, it always starts every email with "I hope this email finds you well," so it gets an instant delete from me.
I hate the one I hate. So I don't know if you get these, where I assume they're AI. Like I've never actually challenged it, but you get an email saying like, "Oh, hi Tony, like nice to meet you, blah blah blah, and I see you like went to this university, or you did this, or like I really like your work on this." And some AI in the background like scraping LinkedIn and whatever, like finding a few bits to make it sound personal. And when I read that, I'm just like, oh my god, like just you use this compute power for something better than spamming me.
Yeah, that's it. I think so. I mean, my background is in sales and marketing, so I have been on the end of the person that's emailing you for you to say stop spamming me. And it's interesting because previously a little bit of personalization like that would have maybe started a conversation because that in a pre-AI world that they would have had to have actually taken time to research, and they're actually trying to find a mutual interest, because they might have something of value, and obviously they're trying to build a relationship up front rather than just a generic rubbish message. But But you're dead right now, and there's endless videos online of people using Google Sheets, dumping out people's LinkedIn profile URLs, and then having generative AI fill in the various gaps based on bio, based on education, and based on all of that sort of stuff. So now, when I've done coaching on the past in terms of prospecting and that sort of stuff, it's what can you find that is actually personal to that individual that they care about? So if they've written a post, for example, it's very difficult for an AI to automatically write a cold email based on a post, because it's not just on a profile page, or like something on Twitter or a blog article or something like that. But the second rule is you've actually got to be interested in it, because otherwise it's manufactured. Yeah, so I am 100% of proponents saying, like, if you are going to try and build relationships with people, try and build relationships on a mutual interest that you are actually interested in, and it's not just a tactic. But yeah, you're dead right. There's no end of tools now that can just literally scrape information, bundle it into a cold email. The term in sales lingo now, or sales tech lingo now, is called icebreaker. So they're called AI icebreakers. And just Google that and you'll see about 30 different tools, of all of these software platforms that will automatically do AI icebreakers for you. So
I wonder if, I'm just kind of thinking if anyone's tried the opposite approach, because I would think I might react better if I got an email saying, this is being sent from an AI thing, but you've matched against our criteria because of this, because of this, because of this.
Yeah.
We've got this product which we think you'd be interested in. Like, this is AI generated, but there's a real person waiting to reply. If this is of interest, let me know, and such and such will have time to speak to you about it. Because then I'd be like, well, at least like I can see like how the algorithm's working, why I've been selected, and then I might be like, okay, well, this is a real thing. Maybe I should speak to this person if it's something of interest.
And that's the key piece. Is it something of interest? Because it's all about timing at the end of the day. For me, what's the value and how can you get it across in the shortest amount of time respectfully? Because for you as a busy individual running a company, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you might prefer a single line email that says, hey, saw you guys do this. You might be struggling with this. We provide this. Is it worth a conversation? It might be 50 characters. And at least then you can say, right, it's taken me 5 seconds to read this. It's respectful. It's not using any sort of spammy, slimy, horrible, like psychological bullshit. It's just like simple message. This is value to be provided. Is this the right time? And in that sense, it doesn't matter whether it's AI generated or not. It's just a message to say, is it worth a conversation? And I think that's the way it might be going, assuming that people still pay attention to their inboxes because it's prolific now.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. It's funny, like I think, I've been running Pixel since 2010 now. And historically, I've been terrible at this kind of like sales and marketing and stuff because I'm a developer. I'd be happy and just sat in a dark room writing code. But actually, like reaching out to people, like I've never done a cold outreach campaign. I never cold call people, or I never like hire salespeople to do that kind of stuff. But there's always this niggling thought in the back of my mind. It's like, oh, maybe I'm missing out. Maybe I should be doing that. But it almost means, I don't know, when I do approach people, like occasionally I'll send a message on LinkedIn if I've seen someone posting something and I think genuinely this person's got a problem that maybe I can help. All of my kind of outbound stuff is coming from that sort of genuine place of wanting to help rather than spamming everyone. But yeah, it's just, I don't know, I'm just kind of rambling, but I almost wish I had that part in me, which is that marketing person to be like, oh yeah, spam the world and see what happens. But it's just not me.
But you do yourself a disservice because you can just burn through data and piss a lot of people off doing stuff that way. So for me, it just comes off the back of genuine interest and a genuine want to help. So if you are seeing people posting stuff, or if you've seen something about a company and you've engaged in a couple of comments, you've already got a bit of a conversation going. Do you feel like you've earned the right to send a connection request because you've already had a bit of a dialogue in the comments? Great. It's likely they'll accept because you've already had that conversation. And then it's just very simple. Hey, look, love some of the stuff you've been talking about. I think we might be able to help. Is it worth a conversation? And then it's not a sales pitch. It's just hey, this is what I do. It'd be great to grab 15 minutes with you at some point. And that's that. But if you ever stuck for inspiration for that sort of stuff, Alex Hormozy is a great guy to follow, and take him with a pinch of salt, because he is like, if you were to describe, if you were to visualize beast mode, this kind of like bodybuilder intense like character, that's him, right? So he wears wife beaters, he's got a bizarre dress sense that's functional. He doesn't care how it looks, it's all functional. He's building all of this, I'd sit in a dark room with headphones on when I do my work because I don't want any distractions, all that sort of stuff. He's trying to build a £1 billion business or $1 billion business, but his books make sense. So he's got $1 million offers and $1 million leads. And $1 million leads essentially just says there's only a few ways to actually get in touch with people. It's cold outreach, which is, I think, becoming less and less. I think social and that content piece is becoming more of a way to get your message out than it is cold outreach. So that's another pillar: content, right? Produce content.
Mhm.
Next one is warm outreach. So who's on your existing list? Can you get a referral? Can anybody make a recommendation? That sort of stuff. And then that's pretty much it. There's not many more strings to the bow in trying to get your message in front of people. And then of course you've got paid ads. And if you get the formula right with paid ads, to the point where you've got, say, like a targeted Facebook campaign that revolves around a problem, you can then point them to a landing page that's a free resource. So here's my 30 pre-canned bits of Python code you can build into Excel straight away. You've then built trust, because you are providing something of value. And then the end of that sequence, if it's in a little bit of an email drip feed, might be, look, does it make sense for us to have a conversation about how Pixel can help you? So every business is different. Happy to pick up the conversation afterwards, but yeah, you've got to decide what's best for you. And if it's not in your nature to manufacture that sort of approach, then don't force yourself to try and be somebody you're not.
Yeah, cheers. I guess I've more recently been going down that route of, doing the education and providing more video tutorials and video things. Like if you see my sort of LinkedIn feed, there's more things going on there. Just kind of letting people know like what's possible, and then giving that nudge, saying like, if you're ready for this, if this is something you're interested in, then let me know, and I'm here to help, that kind of thing. And yeah, I have like some resources online as well we talk about learning Python. So I have like a little ebook thing which I give away for free, which is it was written specifically for Excel users and VBA developers who are kind of looking to go from, okay, well, I know this stuff now, I know how Excel works, but how do I start learning Python? And it takes them through the very basic stuff of what happens when you type Python on a command prompt, what's a .py file, and all that kind of stuff we're talking to. And yeah, and I guess I wrote that as a pure marketing tool, but hopefully it helps people along the way. And if some percentage of those people that are helped then come back as a customer, then I'm very happy to continue helping them with whatever they're doing after.
100%. And I'll put the link in the show notes because, as I say,
Okay.
I've read your blog posts. I've trawled through a fair amount of your content, to be fair, and it's really good stuff. So people need to check it out. We'll put it in the show notes. But coming back to what you said there about VBA. So I've had a couple of conversations on this recently. So a previous podcast guest was a dude called Mark Proctor, who runs Excel Off the Grid.
Mm-hmm.
You may have seen him on LinkedIn and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I heard some of your podcasts with him actually.
Yeah. So we had a bit of a talk about VBA, Office Script, bit about Python, but of course the general pushback with Python, especially in a corporate setting, is not everybody can install Python on their machine. But you and I know there's workarounds, right? Google Colab, Jupyter Notebook, you can now do GitHub.
I have a video on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just because you can't install Python doesn't mean you can't use Python. Where there's a will, there's a way. But my interest now is being able to, for myself and for listeners, understand what to use and when. And I don't think there is a scientific answer to this, right? But one of your posts does point to the fact that you can use Python to do everything that you can do in VBA.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the first question is the learning curve for people that know how to code VBA and how that translates into Python. And then the second question is, are the use cases the same? And I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, that claim that you can do everything in Python that you can do in VBA is like absolutely true, and I stand by that 100%. And and there's kind of like a technical reason why that's true. This might go over some people's listening heads, but bear with me. So VBA is a programming language, built into Excel, right? But what you're actually doing when you're writing VBA most of the time is actually scripting something underneath called the Excel object model. So when you have a range or you have the application object or whatever it is, like those objects are part of the Excel object model. And the Visual Basic that you're using is essentially scripting what you're doing using that object model. So that object model is kind of accessed through VB, but that's only one of the ways that you can access it, because actually that entire thing is exposed via a Microsoft technology called COM, a very old technology, and that's actually how Excel works. Is using this COM technology, that lets other applications interface with it to call this object model. And Python's no different. Python can interact perfectly well with COM. And so because you've got that entire object model available, you actually have like a one-to-one mapping between calls in VBA to calls in Python to achieve exactly the same thing. And there isn't anything extra in VBA really that isn't just using that object model. So that's why I can make that claim very, very confidently that that you can do everything in Python that you could do in VBA using that Excel object model.
Okay. Now that's fine, and we like a scientific answer, and you've answered perfectly there. So thank you for that. In terms of learning curve, is it similar? Because maybe we can assume, rightly or wrongly, that if somebody has the ability to script in VBA, that they've potentially got the ability to write code in Python, right?
Yeah, definitely. I always say, I mean, it's quite facetious me to say this, but I always say, like, whatever language, it's all like if this, then that. But definitely, like, if you spent some time writing in VBA, or you've just used Excel to like you know what formulas are and this kind of stuff, you can learn Python, no question. I think going back to, I was saying you could do everything in Python that you can do in VBA, but I think that also raises the question of like, well, why would I? Right? If there's just a one-to-one mapping, like why would I bother learning Python if I can do all of this stuff in VBA? And I think that explanation of mine really kind of misses the point that, yeah, you can access all of this object model, so you can write to Excel, you can select data and all of this kind of stuff, but it's all the stuff in between, getting some data from Excel, doing some stuff in between, and then writing the data back to Excel, whatever it is. And it's that stuff in between where a lot of things are hard in VBA, and using the Python packages that we were talking about earlier, they become much easier and therefore much more accessible to a wider group of people doing it in Python. And I always kind of give the example, like, VBA is this Turing complete language, so you could write your ML models in that. You could, in theory, like implement ChatGPT in that. But how long would that take, and how slow would it be? It would take you forever, essentially. I did another video I did was on what was it? It was like a fuzzy VLOOKUP thing using some NLP stuff. And yeah, you could write a whole load of NLP stuff in VBA, but you'd be writing it from scratch, from very, very low level. Or in Python, you can just take advantage of all of the sort of scientific computing stuff that's been written by other people and well tested and well documented and all this kind of stuff, and just import SciPy or import whatever it is, and then you've got all of that to use. And so that's really like one of the things that's really valuable about going from VBA to Python, is it suddenly opens up this huge ecosystem of more stuff that you can do more easily, because you're reusing huge amounts of work that millions of people have done over decades.
There we go.
I kind of lost track of what your question was then, but
No,
I hope somewhere in
it was to
that
do with
there's an
learning
answer.
curve, and it was absolutely fine. And again, coming back to the AI piece, providing you do it chunk by chunk and don't try and climb Everest before you've stepped over a mound. It's one of those where people definitely need to be having a look. I think that and I'm conscious of time, so we'll try and start wrapping up in a bit. But for me, I'm still trying to get my head around what to use and when. Not necessarily in terms of coding language, but in terms of where I deploy the code and whether code is the right answer or whether it is a automation platform. And I'll give you some examples. So some of my Python use cases have been, again, coming back to podcasts and media and that sort of stuff, splitting a video in half, like Python code and again, that was a little app, just popped up, you put in the timestamp and then it splits the video in half without having to import and export from an editor. It was a lifesaver. And I think that uses, I can't remember the name of the tool, but I think it's FFmpeg or something like that.
Mhm.
Can then be built into Python. So that was one example. But of course, that runs locally on my machine. The other one was using Python to pull screenshots out of a video, which I had no idea that it could do. Again, that was just another random question the other day. Oh, like, it'd be nice to get some screenshots so I can actually capture like freeze frames from conversations. Oh, of course it can do that. All that sort of stuff. How many screenshots do you want? Oh, I'll have 100, please, and then log up my hard drive and all of that sort of stuff. So I think sometimes we've got to accept that there are some use cases that we have to run locally, either due to the location of the data or the accessibility of that data. So using the other example, some of the experimentations I've done in stuff like Google Colab and GitHub Codespace is just uploading Excel to the root folder of wherever my notebook is and getting it to do a dump out of that root folder or just do some visualization in the notebook itself. And in that case, obviously, I'm importing and exporting. So in using CodeSpace recently, I was thinking, right, well, if my files are in a cloud location, in theory, I'm less reliant on running the code locally because I can use CodeSpace in the cloud, which is basically just emulating Visual Studio Code, isn't it? It's exactly what it's doing. But then you get into the hurdle of, oh yeah, I mean, you can call a file from OneDrive, but then you've got to use the API and you've got to go through all of the credentials and the authorization and all that sort of stuff. And it then goes from, this was meant to be an easy project and me being able to reformat data at a certain frequency to, I've now got to learn an API. So the next question is then, right, okay, well, why don't I just use Power Automate for that? But then, of course, the limitation with Power Automate, the only way to build in Python into Power Automate is to use an Azure Function app, which I've tried using. I've tried building one of those and failed. Failed so hard in doing that. I managed to deploy the app. Yeah, I managed to finally get there after lots of banging my head against the wall. And then I couldn't get it to work in Power Automate, so I totally gave up. But I don't know whether I'm making sense. I'm still struggling at the moment to cloudify my processes, but still seeing some pretty big hurdles in terms of my own knowledge gap and accessibility of data that is providing real issues for me to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to, I mean, we talked about pragmatism before, and it's a big question, like I always ask, is what's this code for? Like, who's going to use it and how often is it being used? So, if you're working in an enterprise and you've got 100,000 people that are going to use your piece of code, it's going to get run millions of times a day, say, then you need to employ engineers who really understand this cloud stuff, who can do the Azure Python functions, who can make it, seamless as possible in a way that's scalable. But if you're just like one person who's using this, every now and then ad hoc, then just run a script from VS Code. Like, why make your life hard? and oftentimes it's somewhere in between. You might be a single developer building a web app for a desk of 10 traders or something like that. And in that case, maybe it makes sense to find some local resource on a server that you can deploy some stuff to, or put it out on AWS or Azure or whatever it is. But I think it's always like just keeping in mind like who's the audience, and try not to kind of make things more complicated than they necessarily need to be. And to your point, like having to go and learn all the APIs for getting stuff from OneDrive or whatever. Sure, if this is for an enterprise organization, then it may be worth spending the time or having a technology team like look into that and do that. But if it's just for your own personal use, then if you're doing that as a hobby and you want to spend your time learning that stuff, then that's great. And if it helps your learning, then then brilliant. But if you're there at 7 p.m. on a Friday night, being like, I've just got to get this thing to work, then yeah, like there's no shame in just hitting run in VS Code, I would say.
But
It's funny. I always say this to people as well with, because obviously, like, so Pixel is, this Python add-in for Excel. And when I talk to people, particularly in these sort of enterprise organizations, it's like, what tools do your users actually use? Is it worth building like some huge application framework to host some web application that does something to present a grid control to your users to get some calculations done? Because you'll spend 6 months building that, and then they'll say, oh, this grid doesn't work in exactly the same as Excel, in the same way as Excel. Can you fix that? So I was I guess this is like the real I suppose sales pitch for Pixel, is that it really lets you use Excel as your user interface. So if you've got users working in Excel, then don't sort of make them switch context and go to some web app or some rich client app or something like that. You can meet them in there and deploy your Python code to them in Excel in a way that's kind of natural and seamless for them to consume it. Sorry, I got off to a bit of a tangent there.
No,
But
it's absolutely fine, and I think I'm just going to have to rein myself in sometimes, and I guess to set a little bit more context for this. So at some point, I will be producing some digital courses, all of that sort of stuff, and it will all relate to the way that I have built more freedom into my life in using these tools. So most people know that up until now I've been working a full-time job, and then I've been doing the personal brand as a side hustle, and true to my word, I've done that. I've only done it outside office hours because I think it's the right thing to do until the point that you say, right, well, I'm going to work for myself. But a key part of that is, if you are providing tuition to people on how to adopt some of these tools, you have to make sure that you are recommending that they use platforms that are accessible. Going to back to our point previously, if the majority of people don't have the authorization to download Python on their machine, therefore you need to give them a means of being able to at least run the code as a training exercise without needing to do that. The next piece then comes into the shareability and being able to provide templates. So if I am then, producing code, linking to a data source that I might then share and all of that sort of stuff, the only way that I'm going to be able to share it effectively is if that information exists in the cloud and they can run the code and be able to recall that information without having to manually upload stuff and write a load of API scripts and all of that sort of stuff. So that's the dilemma at the moment, is how to make what my process is at the moment most accessible so people can deploy it themselves to see the value without having to build the tech stack that I've amassed locally.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the challenges with Python is, we both know it's not difficult to install Python, but maintaining an environment with all of the various dependencies and using virtual env and stuff like that, for someone that's coming to Python for the first time, that can be quite overwhelming. And as you quite rightly say, like, a lot of people will be in organizations where actually they can't even run the Python installer to get started. And there's ways around that, and we wouldn't want people to circumvent IT policies. But it is like one of these hurdles that people come across, and certainly there are sort of online resources where you can learn Python, consume resources, try stuff out, is super valuable. And until you get to the point where, and I think this is happening a lot, certainly in finance, I think, well, maybe it's kind of already happened to a certain extent in finance, where the powers that be sort of recognize the value in people being able to do a bit of coding themselves or have knowledge of these things. So they're internally offering more coding training, Python training, and making it probably not by default. Not everyone has Python on their desktop, and not everyone's allowed to install it. But there is a route where people can say, "Oh, I'm doing this course, and like this is really valuable to me." Speak to your manager, and then get that approval to get that local Python install. And then all of the kind of constraints that we were just talking about with, the data not being available because it's only a file locally that you can't upload to the cloud. Probably if you're an enterprise organization, you might be able to write some Python code on a cloud service, but you probably can't start uploading your valuable work information to a cloud service.
Mm.
But getting your sort of foot in the door, learning some stuff, and then saying, actually, this is useful to me, I want to keep doing it. Then like move to a local install means you can be like that much more productive and do these things in I guess, making your life easier by just running some of that code locally.
Yeah, the trials and tribulations of becoming a teacher, eh? There we go. So, I mean, I don't want to. If you've got a few more minutes, it'd be good for you to be able to outline some of the differences between Pixel that is spelled. Is it PyXLL? Is that how it's spelled?
That's right. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a story behind it. But...
Okay, you can tell the story in a second as well. But in terms of the question that people might be asking, which is, Microsoft are going to allow us to run Python in Excel. How is Pixel different? So over to you to
Yeah,
answer that
absolutely.
question.
Yeah, so Pixel, and the reason it was called Pixel is kind of, if you know about Excel add-ins, native add-ins in Windows are file name .xll. So it was really just Python and XLL. And I used to call it PyXLL. And then the more people started using it, the more other people started calling it Pixel. And I was like, no, it's PyXLL, like this is, and then I got to the point, I was like, no, like Pixel's a really good name. Like, why am I fighting this? And so, so that's why it's called Pixel now. It wasn't, it's kind of an accident. But yeah, like with the new Python and Excel announcement, it's really interesting, like what Microsoft have done, and it sounds like similar to Pixel, but it's actually couldn't really be more different apart from the fact that they're both using Python. And just to give you like a really quick technical difference, so Pixel is an XLL which is loaded into Excel locally, and it loads your Python runtime locally and embeds the Python interpreter into the running Excel process, and that lets you do things like write user-defined functions, macros, call all the Excel object model that we are just talking about, do real-time data, and do like custom user interfaces, and all the kind of stuff that you might have seen in other add-ins do. Whereas the Python in Excel, the Microsoft thing, is quite different in that it's letting you. It's almost more like an extension to their existing sort of formula language, where rather than writing a formula in an Excel cell, you can write a Python script. And then when you enter that Python script and calculate, what happens is that Python script gets sent off to an Azure container and run there. And any data that Python script needs is kind of referenced, and all of that data gets shipped off to Azure. Your Python code runs, and then the results come back to Excel. So very, very different approach technically, but what it means is that your Python code and your workbook are kind of entirely intertwined. So there's no like separation there. So it's great for if you can't install Python and you want to try like just a snippet of code you've got from ChatGPT, yeah, you can chuck that in a cell and it will run and you'll get the results back. There's various kind of limitations, like you can't install third-party packages because it's all in a pre-canned Azure environment. You can't access like internet resources. You obviously can't access local resources because it's not running locally. But for little Python snippets, you can do that. Whereas the use case for Pixel is kind of somewhat different. When I first came up with Pixel, the idea was I was working in finance in a sort of front office technology role, and I was building tools and solutions for traders and analysts and those kind of people. And whenever, as a team, we kind of deploy stuff to them, the first question that would always come back is, okay, this is great. How do I get this into Excel? So you'd end up writing stuff to export data to Excel, to import data, like from Excel sheets, all this kind of stuff you're used to. But I thought, well, there must be a better way to like bridge those two things. And I looked at other languages, and there were ways of, you can write an Excel add-in in C or C++, like no problem. But for Python, there was nothing. And that was kind of the idea behind Pixel, was to be able to build functionality, unit like functions that people can call, or macros, or whatever it is, and then deploy that to Excel users. So from the Excel users' point of view, their experience is they're just using Excel. They're probably used to using the Bloomberg add-in. They're used to calling functions, that kind of stuff. So you can extend that and give them functions that access, your firm's risk system, or your quant team's quant models, that kind of stuff, all within Excel. And with Pixel, the code lives entirely outside of Excel. It's just referenced. It's just loaded in. So it means that if you need to make changes, you want to make additions, you want to make fixes, you do that once, you update your Python code that everyone else is referencing, and then everyone's got that latest version. Whereas with the Python in Excel model, you might have like a cell with some code in. You email that to someone in a different department. They're like, oh, that's great. This code's really interesting. Doesn't quite do what I want. They make some changes. They then send that to someone else. And it's the same problem that we've experienced with VBA over the years, where you end up with these workbooks full of VBA code, and they're the same workbook, but they're all slightly different, and they all work in slightly different ways. And by keeping that code like really hardly coupled into the workbook, you're never going to get away from that. And so, like I say, for like an individual contributor, an individual user wanting to play around with Python, like that's a really great entry point for them. But when you actually start wanting to build applications or toolkits or things like that, but you just want to be able to access those from Excel, then that's where Pixel, I think, is adds a lot more value, because really it just lets, as a Python developer, it lets you use Excel as another user interface tool. So why learn how to deploy stuff as a web app, or build like something in WX or Qt or something, when your users are already in Excel? You can use Excel as your application front end. And for Excel users, it means that they're not having to understand what all these Python code's doing, and understand that when they copy and paste it from one place in the workbook to another place, suddenly it stops working, because they already know how to use Excel. They're well used to writing formulas, but they can have just these sort of higher level functions written in Python made directly accessible to them.
So we had a bit of a technical issue. My audio and video cut off from here, so we'll skip to the part where Tony tells you how to find him.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll send you some links afterwards, but just pixel.com, pyxll.com is the business website, and Tony Roberts on LinkedIn. Tony@pixel.com is my email. So yeah, feel free to reach out through any of those channels. I have a YouTube channel as well. I think I can't remember what it's called. I think if you search for Pixel, you'll find it.
Hey again, and thanks for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like, review, and subscribe. And for more goodies, head over to adamshilton.com. Until next time, bye.